Okay. Yes, thanks again. Yeah, like I said, having a software security panel, perfect timing for everything that's come out, and hopefully everyone learned a little bit from the group there. So next, what we're going to do is I'd like to introduce Mike Epley for our next industry perspective. Mike is Red Hat's Chief Architect and Security Strategist. So he will be presenting for the next few minutes.
All right.
Take it away, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. And, on that last speaker, I think one of the things I loved was you mentioned open source and the importance of open source for our nation's security and cybersecurity in general. And can't agree more. Red Hat being, of course, one of the world's largest open source vendors, and security has always been at the forefront of what we do, and we have led in many respects. I always cite the example of SC Linux. It's baked into Linux and is a mandatory access control framework that we partnered with NSA to deliver to the industry, and now it's baked into everything we do and provides kind of foundational security for things like zero trust. So with that note, I'm going to hopefully give you and share some of the insights talking with our vendors, our partners, many of the folks in this room I've probably had conversations with around zero trust. Folks like at Fortinet, we've had discussions with how do we do zero trust better. And I want to share you those insights that I've gathered from those kind of discussions, and as well as hopefully make some predictions about where the industry is going with respect to helping implement and realize zero trust today. So with that note, I'm going to start by basically saying, I come from industry. I also come from the intelligence community and the DoD, where I spent a good chunk of my career, and I've seen, I think, what I see as the DoD and IC doing and applying zero trust principles even before it was cool. And they're very mature, but they still also have a long way to grow. So organizations that even are very sophisticated with respect to security can still do things better, and I think that's going to be true going forward for everybody. I also have not noted here is experience working with Red Hat, basically defining and building out our zero trust strategy. So along with some other folks in this room here, and I see one in the back, I'll point him out, we are trying to develop strategies and plans for improving our own products, technologies, how to better utilize these to implement and realize zero trust, as well as provide guidance and actionable things that we can provide for our customers and for industry about how to implement zero trust. So first thing I'm going to note that I am a vendor. I'm coming from Red Hat, and I have a little bit of a skewed perspective in there. The entire IT industry I cannot represent. There's lots of other players in here. Historically, of course, the cybersecurity space, there's been niche players and niche security services and tools. And they form an important part of the zero trust story, but not necessarily the only part. They are what I'll call a feed into that zero trust concept, and an important one, but not necessarily one that I can provide a lot of perspective around. But it is the entire IT industry as a whole, including software vendors and these kind of services, as well as, and I think this is going to be important in the near future, the people that are going to provide advisory and consulting services about what to do next, and how to plan and strategize around implementing zero trust. So with that, where I see we're at today and where we're going is kind of really what I want to dive into. So when you talk about zero trust today, and you mostly talk about what I would call a philosophy, zero trust up until EO 14028 was talked about, but it was not mandatory. It wasn't a requirement, and it was talked about in a theoretical sense. And there wasn't a lot of actionable guidance to define what that is and what that means. And so right now, we're in that transition period of turning that philosophy into real action and real things that you can do today to improve your cybersecurity. Similarly, right now, on the vein of actionable, part of the reason why we're doing this is because of this mandate, right? We have this EO, and we have this requirement to implement zero trust. OMB, CISA, others have been at the forefront of saying, here's how you can do that and convert that into action with things like maturity models and strategy guidance. But in reality, the goal is not to do this stuff because it's a mandate and because somebody's telling you to do it. It's because zero trust is going to measurably improve the cybersecurity posture of all our systems and our entire government. And that means that in order to continue this path forward for zero trust, we're going to have to get beyond the mandate and the requirements of that mandate and start demonstrating real value. That implementing zero trust, following these principles, will measurably improve the cybersecurity posture of your systems. So the next thing I would say is, I think I skipped a slide there. So going from principles to effects is going to be the important thing to make that happen, right? We need to measure these effects. We need to do so in a data-driven way so we make appropriate decisions. When you're implementing Zero Trust, what sort of access controls are going to have the most effect in your security posture? What sort of data and contextual information when your access control decisions are being made are going to have the most effect and provide the least privilege models and the most resistance to potential attacks? So measuring that and providing ways that we can define where we're going to make those investments, how we're going to make those investments. And this goes to what I would describe as kind of the problem we see in Zero Trust today. And it's mostly around the fact that Zero Trust isn't a new concept. Even before the EO, we saw Zero Trust as being an important part of the messaging strategy around, say, network providers and network vendors and network security providers. And they defined the early market and the early concepts and tools for Zero Trust. And we see this today, and I'm going to give a shout out to folks like Zscaler for doing this, right? Because they helped set the standard for what Zero Trust means with respect to the network domain. Unfortunately, that also is a trap, right? So now, every time we talk about Zero Trust, and I have this conversation a lot, we talk about perimeterization, all right? The important thing in the heart of Zero Trust is not about the network perimeter. That's just a tool, and that's part of Zero Trust, but there's a lot more to Zero Trust than that. And hopefully, people have seen things like, the CISA pillars. There's several pillars. Every one of these things need to be considered and adapted to and tackled in the Zero Trust sense. And that's sort of the great thing I see coming out of things like CISA and their guidance is extending that narrative into those domains. The real problem, though, is that's only the first step, right? These are the important domains, and we're still in the early stages of defining how to apply these Zero Trust to these other domains. A good example, ones that we haven't given much thought to: edge computing, AI/ML, DevOps, and DevSecOps. These things are all going to affect, and what I mean by DevOps, by the way, is like that entire supply chain, right? We're going to have to start thinking about how do we apply this in this sense, and we have to do that before we fall into the same trap again with these other domains. And Zero Trust is defined only in, say, the CISA domain, 5 pillars, for example. A good example, like in the AI/ML space. I've been asked a lot lately, and because there's been some recent research, for AI/ML, how do you provide explainable AI, explainable models? Can you prevent someone from polluting or poisoning your model and the training in that so that you can actually rely on the predictions that AI/ML creates? If you look at modern neural nets, for example, trillions of neurons and trillions of connections, it is not humanly tractable to do so. And in fact, there's now theorems that basically say you cannot prevent that poisoning from happening. So the only way we're going to be able to protect that AI/ML model is by applying Zero Trust, controlling access to the data and the training processes and the process of operationalizing that AI/ML model. All right, last kind of thing that we've got here is, and this is what I call the holistic problem. Right now we're thinking of Zero Trust and cybersecurity from a security perspective. We as an industry are trying to change that narrative, especially myself, into the idea that it's a holistic strategy for building enterprise systems. That last panel discussion, for example, I heard the question, how do we understand vulnerabilities for that integrated system when we have vulnerability reporting, things like that are mostly targeted at identifying vulnerabilities in specific packages or particular pieces of software. And that's because we don't have that holistic view, and our best tools today to apply that are things like managing it through an RMF process, doing post-system integration, testing, and validation through that process. And I firmly believe risk management is important, but we also have to do the same thing from a security perspective from the outset, and we design and architect these systems for Zero Trust on the outset. All right, I'm going to conclude with making a couple quick predictions here as well. So really, what's next, right? So Zero Trust, as I noted, is not a new concept. Many people in the industry have been following that, the development of Zero Trust since the early days of the Jericho Forum. And the EO, of course, has helped push that forward, and we can learn a lot from that process, though, and through my crystal ball, say what's going to happen next, and what's going to the next 10 years of zero trust going to look like? Now, you'll also see here the date 2027, and the reason why that date's significant is because this is the DoD, an organization I just described as being pretty mature already in terms of zero trust. And they themselves are saying it's going to be 2027 before we actually are able to call ourselves mature from a zero trust perspective. We have a long road ahead of us still. The future is a little uncertain. But one of the things I do think is going to be important, probably in the near-term future, is going to be things like compliance and compliance standards for zero trust, right? Going back to my comment about effects and making things actionable and measurable is one of the ways that we can help that process along is providing more concrete ways to measure that. And compliance tools are a great way to do that. So I expect that'll happen. I mentioned, for example, AI/ML a second ago, right? This is going to be another tool, and I mentioned, there may be the vulnerability that AI/ML might represent, but it also presents opportunities as well. So we're going to be able to apply AI/ML tools to the process of making access control decisions, making risk-based access analyses, and those tools are going to be important to, in the future, to build into our zero trust access control systems so that we can provide real data to make those access control decisions, and hopefully in real time as well. And then the last one, I would say is, a specialization. I mentioned a couple domains, Edge, and AI/ML, and things of that nature. And these kind of specializations will be important, again, to tailor the concepts of zero trust so that we can actually make progress in implementing those. Right now, our specializations are mostly focused around things like MFA, right? So we're trying to say, hey, how can we do better identity proofing for issuing credentials? And that's an important tool and an important part of that identity access management space and going to feed into zero trust. But there's probably many, many other applications where we're going to have specialization to adapt zero trust principles to our tools. All right, so that's, I think, all I got. I want to conclude with maybe a couple minutes for some Q&A if I still have time, but I know we're trying to rush the schedule along.
So,
all right.
Mike,
so thanks, appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike will be available as well as the rest of the Red Hat team. I know we have a few folks here for any questions you might have.